gente. Bom dia a todas e todos. Estamos iniciando o último seminário do ano, o último seminário de 2019, o último seminário da casa aqui no Cebrap. Prazer ter vocês aqui e um prazer maior ainda de ter um convidado bem especial, um convidado internacional, professor lá na Universidade da Califórnia, em Berkeley, Charles Hirschkind, que eu vou aqui fazer uma brevíssima apresentação, que tem uma longa trajetória, muitas obras. Ele é professor associado do Departamento de Antropologia da Universidade de Califórnia, em Berkeley. E entre as suas principais obras, The Ethical Soundscape, Cassette Sermons and Islamic Counterpublics, foi uma obra bastante premiada, recebeu o prêmio, o Sharon Stephens First Book Award da American Ethnological Association e também a menção honrosa no Clifford Geertz Prize em Antropologia da Religião, né? É um livro bastante interessante que explorou aí a questão da disseminação dos cassetes, né, da gravação em cassete das pregações muçulmanas islâmicas. Só que hoje o Charles, na verdade, vai falar de um outro tema do seu recente trabalho, What a 12th Century Muslim Says to a 12th Century Christian, in Narrating a Complex Religious Identity. Quero agradecer também ao projeto temático da Paula, né, que convidou o Charles e possibilitou que ele estivesse aqui, o projeto Religião, Direito e Secularismo, a reconfiguração do repertório cívico no Brasil contemporâneo. E quero então dar as boas-vindas ao Charles. Thank you to come to Cebrap. Welcome to Cebrap. It's a pleasure to have you here. And so we can start with some presentation. After that, you can have some discussion about with the public. Okay? Thank you, Charles.
Thank you for those words, and thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I feel a little embarrassed that I don't speak Portuguese at all.
No, don't worry about that.
It's kind of a serious flaw, but I'll hope to fix it at some point. So I will try to read this slowly. But if it's incomprehensible, you tell me. I'll look in your eyes to see if all right. So, let's see if that works. Okay. In a photograph taken by a friend in the early 1920s, the Spanish poet Federico García Lorca appears dressed as a Moor with turban and jalabia. The fashion of having oneself photographed in Arabic garb was not uncommon at the time among the literati of Granada, and even today it is not uncommon among tourists who flock to the city. For most historians and literary scholars, Lorca's playful forays into popular Orientalist gesture on this and other occasions has served to vouchsafe a judgment that the poet's relation to Arabic culture was superficial and folkloric, and hence inessential to the development of his own poetic voice. As with other Andalusian intellectuals of his generation, these flirtations with what is generally viewed as vulgar or exoticism, it is said, testify to the fact that he was not immune to the fascination that the Orient exerted on the imagination of the Spanish, and especially the Andalusians, but indicate little more. In the poet's own writings, however, we encounter a different view of his relation to the Middle East and its traditions. Lorca had a passionate attachment to the city of his birth, Granada, and attributed much of his poetic vision to the city itself. Granada, in his words, formed and molded the creature that I am. In poetry, prose, and theatrical works, he explored the personality of the city in its many facets, the customs and character of its inhabitants, the textures, colors, and moods of its streets and houses, the many faces of its aesthetic and spiritual life. Following the sensuous contours of the city, along their polysemous historical routes, Lorca was drawn continuously toward the manifold traditions embodied in the hybrid city, sometimes to the Romani or Gypsy contribution, but also insistently to the Arabic and Islamic. For the poet, Granada could never be entirely Western, as its poetic articulation required that he leave the West, explore and develop his own Granadan voice, through an engagement with Arabic and Persian poetry. To do poetic justice to the city that, as he claimed, formed and molded him, he was called to expand his aesthetic horizons outside of Spain and beyond the literary vocabularies of Europe, so to become a faithful interpreter of and contributor to this, the lyrical mosaic of this Mediterranean city. Lorca's presentation at the 1922 Concurso del Cante Hondo, the concourse on deep song, that he co-organized with the Spanish composer Manuel de Falla, exemplified this vision. In his talk, he underscored the, quote, gestures and lineaments of Islamic poetry that lay within the Andalusian musical tradition, reciting verses from 3 Muslim poets, while giving particular emphasis to the, quote, sublime ghazals of love of Hafiz, the 14th century Persian poet. Juxtaposing verses of Cante Hondo with those of Hafiz, Lorca traced the proximities of image, emotion, and theme across the 2 poetic repertoires, giving special attention to the shared vocabularies of love, anguish, and the presentment of death, as if the dark, blood-soaked sentiments he heard in this musical form could only be glimpsed in the mirror provided by the verses of Arab and Persian poets. When Hafiz addresses the theme of weeping, he noted, he does so with the same expressions as our popular poets, with the same spectral construction and on the basis of the same sentiments. Lorca's viewpoint belongs to a particular Spanish tradition that dates from the late 19th century and continues today, one sometimes called Andalusismo. While this term is often used to designate a regional nationalist movement in southern Spain, nationalism is only one face of the phenomenon. Andalusismo, as I interpret it here, is a modern tradition of critical reflection on the norms of European politics and culture, based upon a cultivated appreciation for the histories and legacies of southern Iberia's Muslim and Jewish societies. This tradition is founded on a seemingly simple principle that contemporary Andalusia and contemporary Spain and Europe more broadly is linked in vitally important ways with al-Andalus, or medieval Islamic Iberia, and that the challenges faced by Andalusians today, and by Europeans more broadly, require a recognition of that historical identity and continuity. Al-Andalus in this formulation is not a distant mirror from which to reflect on contemporary challenges, a beautiful image to inspire, but a critical dimension of our contemporary existence. The task of the Andalusistas thus can be described as a kind of historical therapeutics, a reorientation of cultural and political subjectivity through this excavation of a buried past. It is carried out in multiple ways. People seek to accommodate their lives to the demands of an inheritance only partially available to knowledge, and thus one often more felt than known. In this sense, the tradition is anchored less in a subject than in a sensibility, one that traverses people and practices. Since the late 19th century, this sensibility has found expression across a heterogeneous set of trajectories, movements across geographic, moral, social, and aesthetic registers that in different ways open up the historical borders of al-Andalus onto our present, and in doing so, proffer a different historical geography from which to think about contemporary Spain and Europe and their relation to Islam and the Middle East. Contrary to most interpreters of this tradition, I do not conceive of Andalusismo as a species of, or not solely as a species of Orientalism or romantic nationalism, nor as a project that constructs a past that will support a more capacious form of national identity, a more inclusive form, for example, bringing in the Arab dimensions into national identity. This is not to say that tradition has not been recruited for nationalist and regionalist ends, or for the politics of liberal multiculturalism, or for the politics of identity, we would say. But the past that Andalusistas find themselves to inhabit, feel themselves compelled to passionately acknowledge, does not anchor a pre-given identity so much as unsettle the grounds on which existing identity formations rest. Surrounded by the material, artifactual, and linguistic remnants of al-Andalus, the followers of this tradition discover themselves to be inheritors of a past that, while elusive, inaccessible in some aspects, nonetheless demands to be listened to openly, even if this listening disturbs or unravels their sense of identity as Europeans, as Spaniards, or as Andalusians, and as Catholics, I would say, in ways. Independently, there is no single political perspective authorized by this tradition. For example, while Lorca was murdered by right-wing military forces in Grenada at the beginning of the Civil War in 1936, his fellow Andalusista and occasional interlocutor, Rodolfo Gil Ben Umaya, who I'll speak about later on, remained a colonial official within the Franco regime throughout much of his career. And many Andalusistas were part of the fascist regime. What unites thinkers within this tradition is not a political prescription, but the sense of a shared Andalusian historical legacy as the ground from which the present must be encountered, interrogated, and lived. So it embraces a multiplicity of political positions, though a shared sensibility about how to think about the present in relation to the past. Importantly, there is no single, from the standpoint of Andalusismo, I discuss Lorca's Arabian flirtation, like dressing up like a Moor, can be seen as something other than Orientalist fantasy or romantic whimsy. The Andalusistas, of whom Lorca was one, are Spaniards who have discovered that they are not who they thought they were, not the pure-blooded Spanish Catholics that they had been taught they are. From the viewpoint of this tradition, both the Catholic inquisitors of the 16th century and the nationalist historians of today have conspired to hide a secret from them, namely that they are in some significant way, if not quite clear, in some significant way Muslims, Jews, Arabs. Or in a slightly different formulation, that medieval Muslim Iberia did not disappear from history with the seizure of Granada in 1492 by Christian armies, but rather, forced into hiding, it continued on as a secret and invisible warp within the fabric of Spanish society. As a dimension of society not legible through a modern epistemologies of the nation. I want to read Lorca's gesture here as one attempt, albeit a playful one, to give expression to this inheritance. As I explore in this talk, Andalusistas have responded in a variety of ways to the notion that Islam or Arabic culture has played a constitutive role in their own formation as part of a past that has made them who they are. One common response today is conversion to Islam, a trend more established in southern Spain than anywhere else in Europe. Southern Spain has the highest conversion to Islam rate in Europe, which, as I'm saying, is one dimension of this phenomenon. That for many other Andalusistas, though, a recognition of a Muslim and Jewish legacy has led to experiments in what might be called Mediterraneanist self-fashioning, ways of understanding themselves as inheriting a Mediterraneanist kind of identity, let's say. Some of these experiments I explore here. I mean, I would just say, I meant to start with Lorca because most Lorca scholarship has sought to identify Lorca as a poetic voice of Spain, right? To map Lorca onto either a nationalist geography, but also a modern European political geography, as a voice that is part of, a modern European poetic development and so on. When the poet's own self-understanding is one that emphasized the inadequacy of that frame, the necessity of viewing his voice within a broader Arabic, Islamic, Mediterranean genealogy. So it's that erasure of that dimension of his voice from the construction of his voice to European, like what is lost in that construction is one of the things that comes up. The tradition of Andalusismo, I want to suggest, has something important in thinking about questions of Europe and religion, we could say. Andalusistas are destinaries of a religious message from a religion that is not their own. I say religious, though in actuality the past that speaks to them, that passionately compels them, does not come parsed into categories of religion and culture, and indeed at times is subversive of the practices and identities that this distinction between religion and culture upholds. Another way to say this would be that they find themselves interpolated by Islam in ways that defy understanding within the political and conceptual world they inhabit. And this limit within their knowledge gives impetus to the forms of reflection and practice that I'm calling Andalusismo. Right? It's a recognition of having inherited something that is not transparent to the conceptual world that they have been taught they inhabit. In exploring this phenomenon, I want to raise questions of what it might be to be historically constituted as subjects of a religion that one does not recognize oneself to be an adherent to. Okay, that was the introduction. Something like that. Am I reading at a good rate?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, very clearly. Andalusismo first emerges in the late 19th century as a movement among a small group of intellectuals who, confronted with the sense of national malaise provoked by the loss of Spain's overseas empire and the country's state of economic and political weakness, began to seek out resources of national renewal in the nation's past and in the folkloric traditions where that past, in their view, still lived on. Right? And this is a European-wide romantic moment in which the past becomes a resource for rethinking various issues. For some of these thinkers, a reflection on Andalusian traditions led directly to a reconsideration of the Muslim and Jewish inheritance and an acknowledgement of its imprint across the human and material physiognomy of the region. By the second decade of the 20th century, this movement of cultural recuperation, pioneered by fin de siècle intellectuals, became directly linked to a politics of regional autonomy, an ambition that was already well developed in places like Catalonia, and as we see today, and the Basque Country. And in common usage, Andalusismo refers usually to this sort of national, regional movements, and continues to sort of shape the educational policies and cultural policies of the Andalusian state. However, while Andalusismo begins to acquire its recognizable form around the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century, the problem it poses can be traced much further back. Within Spanish Golden Age literature, this is Cervantes, from the 16th to the 18th century, for example, one finds a significant number of works examining the tensions between increasingly monocultural constructions of identity, right, which we often associate with the Inquisition, for example, and the region's Semitic genealogy, then in the process of being erased or rendered illegible. I mean, one of the Inquisition, among its the things that attempted was to erase the traces of not just people, but the traces of Arabic and Jewish culture from language, from custom, from architecture, from, right, a systematic attempt to sort of affect that erasure. And Andalusistas would understand that, that shapes Spanish nationalism, even in the 19th century going forward, and that the nationalist historiography contributes to that same project. The theme that Spain is complexly bound up with its excluded Muslim and Jewish heritage reappears throughout Cervantes' celebrated 17th century novel Don Quixote, most strikingly in the claim that the story's narrator the claim by the story's narrator that the entire account is really a translation from an Arabic text. Right, in Cervantes, in Don Quixote, right, the narrator of the story notes that actually this is a translation from Arabic. And much of the novel, and not just that novel, but many of the writings of the period play with this idea of a kind of of a kind of Moorish presence that also is absent, right? So you don't know, the identity of people is confused often, and this is a key. So even though we can think of Don Quixote is also often celebrated as the first novel of Europe in some, right, within. But it's interesting that the kind of, heteroglossia, the kind of play of voices that makes that novel has to do with the orchestration of relations between Islam and Catholic culture, then in that moment going through a process of erasure and after 800 years of Muslim presence, this kind of question about who Spanish are, right, is something that those novels explore quite. So it's interesting that at the origins of the novel, the relation to Islam is already there in a very complex way, right? That the novel is an attempt to orchestrate that relation, then in the process of being dissolved in a serious way. As Cervantes scholars have noted, behind this rhetorical device lay serious questions about the identity of 17th century Spain and about who exactly were the Spanish in the wake of 800 years of Muslim presence that was then being expunged. Within Andalusista narratives, the historical career of al-Andalus does not conclude with the defeat of the Moors, the Nasrid, it was called the Nasrid dynasty in Granada, in 1492, but continues to exert its presence in subterranean forms, largely unrecognizable within the dominant epistemes of post-1492 Iberia. More precisely, with the collapse of Muslim rule, the history of the peninsula proceeds along three discrete pathways. The first one is the path of exile of those Muslims and Jews who were forced into exile. Jews were forced into exile quite soon after 1492. Muslims were given the option to convert, but then those who converted were forced into exile in 1609 or in the early 17th century. The second path, according to Andalusistas, right, is that which culminates in Spain's dominant political order and is defined by the country's simultaneous Christian and European trajectory, these two elements converging in different moments of their early modern and contemporary development around a shared opposition to Islam and until recently Judaism as well, a Jewish other. Finally, the third historical pathway, according to Andalusismo, is that of a Mediterranean society constitutively entwined with Islamic and Jewish cultural forms and bound, therefore, in a familial relation to the peoples and nations on the other side of the sea. This third historical arc, Andalusistas assert, has been systematically denied across Spanish history, forced into silence and obscurity by the dominant arbiters of public memory, beginning with the Catholic inquisitors themselves in the 16th and 17th centuries. Over the subsequent centuries, the perceptual infrastructure installed by this campaign of erasure became a durable and abiding inheritance, immunizing Spain's national Catholic soul from any attachments rooted in its Muslim and Jewish past. The task assigned to the historiography of medieval Iberia within this enterprise is to sterilize the region from any lived connection to its past, to relegate any vestiges emanating from that past to the museum, so to ensure that whatever imbrications one encounters between al-Andalus and contemporary Andalusia, or between one side of the Mediterranean and the other, that they will not stir in the contemporary European reader any emotion or provoke any action that cannot be contained within or made to serve an existing European political order. The primary lesson of Iberia's Muslim and Jewish history will be that it ended. So in modern historiography in Spain, of course, as opposed to earlier generations, has done emphasizes the importance of this period, right? And it's taught in schools now much more than it was, and people learn it in different parts. But the lesson is certainly learned that it's an impressive and significant part of the past and has absolutely nothing to do with the present. And the lesson is, that's part of the way that works. Let me now turn to the life of, you can think it's interesting if you parallel it, like discussions of slavery in the United States or something. Like this is a political question, like slavery was a horrible part, but it has nothing to do with the present, one could say. Versus an argument that says, well, no, slavery was a horrible period, and actually it still has something to do with the present, right? Those are two, and one thinks about like, what are the sensibilities that orient one to one argument as opposed to the other, right? Or to recognize one's embeddedness within a temporal frame that embraces slavery, as opposed to one that recognizes that has nothing to do with, So let me turn to the life of one important exponent of this tradition, a contemporary and frequent interlocutor and friend of Lorca, who's this fellow. Rodolfo Gil Ben Umayya, that's his name. He was born in Andújar in 1901. He was raised with an appreciation of Andalusian history, and his father was a major scholar of Sephardic Spain, the Jewish traditions of Spain. And he changed his name early. His name was Torres, and he changed it to Ben Umayya after he discovered that his mother had Morisco roots and was a descendant of one of the ruling Umayyad family. The Moriscos were the Muslims who were forcibly converted to Catholicism and later expelled. But of course, they were not all expelled, but the attempt was to expel them all. And it's a debate in Spain, the extent to which they were, how many were expelled, right? In the mainstream historiographic position is that 99% were expelled, and Andalusista tradition be actually no. Many successfully hid within Spanish society. He was trained under the leading Arabists. He studied Islam and the Arabic traditions under Asin Palacios, who was the leading scholar of the day in Madrid. And he was sent in 1925 under the regime of Primo de Rivera to head the Spanish press corps in Morocco. And as I mentioned later, he worked in the Franco regime. This is the Escuela de Bellas Artes in Tetuan, the school, and you can see that the children are all doing the fascist salute. Like that this was in after Franco came to power, that the Franco regime set up many institutions in the part of Morocco that was controlled by Spain, called the Spanish Protectorate, which existed between 1912 and 1956. And Ben Umayya had an important role in setting up this institution. The central paradox of his life is that he spent his entire career working within the institutions of Spanish colonialism and foreign affairs, while simultaneously developing an Andalusista historical and political outlook that required Spain's displacement from its own ideological moorings. He called his political optic that he developed Andalusismo Árabe, Arabic Andalusianism. And I'll just outline some of the rudiments of this view he had. While Spain was usually assigned a distinctive role in Ben Umayya's strategic thinking, it did not monopolize the center of political calculus, nor define the limits of political possibility. Rather, it was the Arabic-speaking world from which Ben Umayya would assess the possibilities of political action and coordination. A world that Spain was historically entwined with, but one that it was not in a position of dominance over. Right? So Ben Umayya was involved in an enterprise to sort of rethink Spain as in its relation to the Middle East, and to displace Spain from the center of that political thinking, but to think Spain from the standpoint of particularly the anti-colonial movements of the Middle East that were taking place, and that Spain's career had to be thought in relation to those movements. That was key to his thinking. Indeed, it was only by virtue of its historical attachment, culturally, linguistically, spiritually, racially, because he adopted the language of race at the time, to the Islamic societies of the Mediterranean, that Spain acquires, in Ben Umayya's view, its singular and universal career within the global movement against European hegemony. Right? And Spain at the time was very much concerned with British and French power, both in the colonies and in Europe. This geopolitical space of political action derived its historical possibility from the civilization produced within medieval Andalusi society, one he found still alive within contemporary Morocco, which he described as sort of a living museum of medieval Spain, though also alive in a latent and fragmentary way in Spain itself. That is, this past of al-Andalus, that past he found both exemplified in Morocco as continuous with it, but also in Spain in a more latent way. Ben Umayya designated this geopolitical space Mediodía, like midi in French, or mezzogiorno in Italian. It's one of his books. Located at the intersection of Orient and Occident, Mediodía conjoins both a civilizational concept, for which medieval Andalus stands as the anchor, right? Because Andalus is the historical anchor that holds together this idea of a unity, right? And it conjoins that with a political analytic through which global struggles against the existing regime of European dominance can be articulated and coordinated. So it's both a historical geography, but also a political optic that has to do with a relation of subordination to European power. This, quote, universe seen from Albaicín, that's the subtitle of one of his books. Albaicín is the Muslim neighborhood of Granada. So he called his book The Universe as Viewed from Albaicín. A historical weave, a historical fabric of aesthetic, linguistic, religious, and political affiliations and affects, of long-buried musical harmonies and cultural correspondences, held out the promise, in Ben Umayya's view, of an antidote to the existing regime of political and geographic norms held in place by European power to the detriment of Spain. Spanish power and Middle Eastern resurgence were two sides of a single coin. Mediodía belongs to the imaginary geographies of Andalusismo, a historical territory imagined, articulated, and produced within the triangular conceptual historical space delimited by medieval al-Andalus on one hand and contemporary North Africa and Spain on the other. So you have Spain, North Africa, and historically al-Andalus as sort of this triangle within which this thought moves. What makes Ben Umayya a particularly interesting guide to this territory, as I explore here, lies in the way his own nomadic itinerary reveals this geopsychic, he calls it, this geopsychic space, to be not only a dream landscape of the romantic imagination, nor simply an instrument of Spanish colonial design, but also a space of political, ethical, and aesthetic possibilities, irreducible to these political projects. There is a protean and fantastical quality to Ben Umayya's writings, as he found himself captivated by the dizzying world of possibilities, of re-territorializations that Andalusismo opened up for him, possibilities of political alliance, of commerce, of linguistic and cultural belonging. In short, a reconfiguration of the global order upon a new basis. His essays brim with excitement over the new world his Andalusismo Árabe offers, and to which he responds with ever-changing models, plans, and strategies. So he published like hundreds and hundreds of articles. He wrote in what was called the Spanish colonial press, but also in Spanish political context, about always from this idea of what it meant to, if one reconceived the world through this different political historical geography, what immense possibilities of alliance, of strategy, of world making. And so his work was sort of dedicated to trying to both convince Spaniards on one hand of the possibilities that this afforded, right? The kind of benefits and like many of those who contributed or contribute today to this tradition of Andalusismo, his writings moved back and forth between medieval Andalus and the contemporary societies of North Africa and Spain, charting the dizzying political possibilities that this inheritance afforded present-day Spaniards and Arabs. Thus, in an early text titled Mediodía, and that he described as an African conception of peninsular history, one major section is dedicated to exploring the Spanish and Middle Eastern traditions of music, architecture, dance, festival forms, food, emphasizing the overlap and genealogical connections that constituted this shared cultural spiritual reality that he saw uniting these regions. While the second part of the text centers on a historical account of the Moors from the first Umayyad dynasty in Iberia up through 1609, when the Moriscos were expelled. This treasure of cultural and historical knowledge, distorted and effaced by the politics of purification carried out over the last 300 years, will allow Spain to reconnect with its, quote, genuine history, an aspiration also enabled by the establishment of the Spanish protectorate in Morocco. So he saw the Spanish protectorate, Spanish colonial occupation, not as simply Spain extending its dominance. He wanted to view that as the beginning of refashioning the map in which Spain would become an integral part of the Middle East. So he was very useful for the Franco regime because his writings were seen to provide a cultural justification, historical cultural justification for Spanish colonialism. This was a position, though, that he sharply contested and criticized, but his works were very useful for, even though he came to oppose it very strongly, as I'll talk about. As with many of the Andalusistas, including Garcia Lorca, Bennu Maya's Andalusista sensibilities were profoundly musical. His writings saturated with the sonic figures and passional repertoires of Andalusian song, of flamenco and cante hondo. Here, I have a picture of flamenco. Throughout his writings, he returned again and again to the musical forms of flamenco or cante hondo, tracing out each line and curve of their emotional geometries, as if the Mediterranean universe he was assembling demanded such a musical infrastructure. These lines and curves led invariably to the south and to the east, to the Arabs, Jews, and Gypsies whose historical experience on Iberian soil resonated in the cry of the flamenco singer and the strum of the guitar. Bennu Maya's prose often achieved its most lyrical effects in the passages on Andalusian song. This should really be read in Portuguese to make... I'll read it, but then... do you have it there?
Yeah, I can try.
Page 12.
A música da Andaluzia é o mais poderoso dos encantamentos. Sua estranha bruxaria é a nota essencial da vida milenar semítica, elemental e indecifrável. É a faithful expression, uma expressão de fé dessa humanidade parda a expressão fidedigna dessa humanidade parda, uma que se desloca de longos períodos de letargia e indolência para as convulsões mais delirantes. A guitarra mediterrânea e a
The tsaina is an instrument in Morocco.
Beduim do Zaina cantam a dor eterna da raça, enquanto um pedaço do espírito escapa da garganta e imerso se imerge num éter de um choro que é ao mesmo tempo uma reza, uma oração e o rugido de um leão no cio.
É quase o Gilberto Freire.
So that gives you a taste of his writings, right? And so his writings were, on one hand, he was a political strategist. He wrote, like, he was, one of the strategists of contemporary writing in political journals and so on. On the other hand, his writing is constantly interspersed, constantly connected to this kind of writing. Right? There is this way in which the political and this, what we would say, a kind of Orientalist, culturalist language are thoroughly entwined in a very interesting way. So the images are very Orientalist, right? The lethargy, the sort of, and so. Usually we think about Orientalism through Said's reading of Orientalism, which would connect Orientalism very directly to colonialism and to the expansion of European power, which certainly was part of its context. But I'm also arguing sort of a different argument that here, right? That in some sense, certainly it played in some ways an instrumental role in that. I'm also tracing a kind of sensibility that necessarily engages the Oriental, like Lorca, right? He also had this sort of Orientalist imagination. He was also, though, studied Arabic, he was reading closely Persian and Arabic poetry, and it was shaped some of the ways in which his own sort of poetic development emerged. And so a lot of Andalusismo, it adopted various kinds of Orientalist stereotypes at times, and yet I'm arguing went beyond the sort of stereotypical. And Ben Umayyah's life is an example because he became a very important contributor to Arab nationalism and to pan-Islamism, which I will describe. This is, if you know the Talal Asad's father is another example of the world that I'm describing. You know, Talal Asad's father was a convert, a Jew who converted to Islam, but who had a very Orientalist. You read his writings; they're completely Orientalist. The Bedouin lives in the desert and is in touch with real nature and so on. But in Asad's case, Asad went on to become one of the primary interlocutors of Islamic reformism in the 20th century, in conversation with the leading figures of Sayyid Qutb, Rashid Rida, all of the main, most important. He wrote much of the Pakistani constitution. And so even though Orientalism, the language was part of what opened the door for him to a certain kinds of connection, this kind of romantic connection, his own trajectory took him far beyond what we would consider to be simply either the instrumental aspect of Orientalism or simply the fantastical part of it, right? For generations of Andalusistas, Andalusian song, flamenco, let's say, has provided the door through which the territory postulated by Andalusismo can be accessed, the entryway by which this occulted historical geography will reveal itself. Banu Umayyah's writings on music often devolve into a kind of mystical poetry, where his descriptive intentions are subordinated to sensory and aesthetic effects, as an attempt to retune the senses of his readers to the Mediterranean world fashioned of Semitic elements long denied. What do I have there? In a section emphasizing the elements common to Andalusian musical forms and the arabesque, these are arabesques, arabesque figures that line the walls of the Alhambra, he takes the reader into a sinuous meditation on the common aesthetic gestures. This I think I can read. In both of these arts, like flamenco and arabesques, right, there is a continuous line, right, that one follows with difficulty until it is interrupted by the intersection of another, more subtle, that extends out, separates off, and narrows in order to join with others and disappear in a great bundle. A little later, the same line reappears, or the same note repeats as by the same law. Notes and lines converge and come apart rapidly in a vertiginous cascade of colors that dissipate in space, like the waves from a stone in the water. The arabesque was a figure, like almost like an icon, one could say, in a Byzantine sense of something one reflects on. You know, for many of the Andalusistas, Lorca particularly, like, wrote extensively on as the key to sort of Andalusian aesthetics. The world Banu Umayyah discovers within these musical and figural aesthetic forms, one in which elements coalesce and disperse, appear and disappear, parallels the Andalusian territory that is the subject of his writing, a kind of liminal space glimpsed only through fragments, traces, ruins, gestures, tastes. He says, "It is a music one cannot hear well, but that one nonetheless feels. Nothing concrete happens, and yet it vibrates." There's a kind of, right, he's aiming for a certain kind of mystical dimension to this. One feels, in other words, what defies categorization within the reigning sensory epistemology, what cannot be discerned by a national Catholic ear, a nothing, right, a non-event, an event emptied by the inquisitional ambition to erase all traces of Islam and Judaism from language, architecture, and music, a non-happening that nonetheless happened and continues to vibrate, as he says. This kind of language through when he is exploring and sort of attuning his readers to a kind of different temporality, attuning readers to the presence of al-Andalus in the present. Importantly, Banu Umayyah's exploration of the convergences between medieval and modern worlds was not limited to history and aesthetics, but embraced an ever-shifting array of political projects. I'll mention just a few. Immediately after having arrived in Morocco to work as a journalist, he began to establish relations with the then nascent nationalist movement in Morocco. Relations that often became close friendships and that endured across his life, leading to multiple forms of collaboration with the nationalists, including commercial forms, intellectual forms, and political. His collaborations with Moroccan nationalists led him to be arrested by the Franco regime, even though when he was working for it as well. So he was like, he had this ambivalent relation to it. Following Moroccan independence, his contributions to Morocco did not go unappreciated. He was the first Spaniard to be invited to Morocco once it was sovereign. Propelled by his widening conflicts with national leaders in the 20s forward, he became increasingly concerned with engaged with the wider arena of what's called a Nahda, the Arabic awakening then taking place, the broad anti-colonial movement from late 19th century across the Middle East that embraced both Arab nationalist and pan-Islamist currents. In numerous articles and books, he sought to educate his Spanish readership in the currents of religious and political thought that were emerging in various parts of the region in the context of the awakening, and including to inform them more generally about the art, the architecture, the religion, the history of a region whose destiny, in his view, was inseparable from Spain. In 1936, he was sent by the Franco regime to Cairo as a member of its delegation, cultural mission. There in Cairo, he met with the leading pan-Islamist and pan-Arabist leaders and began to write in conjunction with them and translate their writings and publish them in Spanish journals, but worked closely in close collaboration with many of the very most prominent ones. Insomuch as his vision of Mediodía also extended to Latin America as another region embraced in his view by the Hispano-Arabic culture of al-Andalus, he met on multiple occasions with prominent Arab leaders from the region in order to enlist their support for the broad anti-colonial movement he envisioned. So he traveled to Latin America. He thought the key to he saw what was, Latin America was conjoined with al-Andalus, both because, they both have this 1492 sort of moment, but it also had to do with the prominence of Arab leaders. This is not really that crucial. The prominence of Arab leaders in Latin American countries, right? He thought that those Arab leaders were the key, right? Think how many Lebanese presidents and so on, right? He saw them as key, and so that they would provide the kind of connection between Latin America, the Middle East, and Spain, because they were all connected by al-Andalus. So he went and met many of them, and tried to coordinate efforts with them. In the 1950s, his name was put forward by the Arab League to act as a representative of that organization for Latin America. So he was not an Arab, he was not Latin American, but the Arab League saw him as the Arab representative from Latin America. Right. So I'm saying is that his activities were also appreciated, and the world he was trying to construct in which he was a kind of Arab, and he was also Latin American because it was part of the world he was imagining, was also recognized by the Arab League in some ways. Right? Bennu Umayyah's Andalusista vision also required a pedagogical effort in Spain. The construction of what he called Arabic Spain required that Spaniards be taught Arabic in schools, as well as the principles of Islam. As the Spanish anthropologist González Alcantú has noted, Bennu Umayyah understood the defense of Spanish-Arabic bilingualism as a defense against other imperialisms, and as a means to give concrete dimension to this transnational Andalusismo that he was trying to create. He also coordinated with Lorca in the founding of a university. It was to be called the University of the Alhambra, and in some ways many of their efforts led to that university wasn't founded, but the Department of Semitic Studies in the University of Granada was founded in 1932, largely because of their efforts in many ways. And it remains a very important site for training, including many people coming from the Middle East. Bennu Umayyah has often been seen as another Orientalist gone native, a Spanish Lawrence of Arabia, seduced by the romantic pleasures of the Moroccan Medina, imagining himself a strategist in the struggle for Arab freedom. Such assessments, in my view, fail to do justice to his biographical trajectory, to his consistent and continuous attempt to think from what might be called an impractical dimension of reality. Right? We could call it a virtual dimension of reality, but it's also a historical dimension. The space that he designated as Mediodía. Right, all of his plans, both his aesthetic, his political, his activities, all were sort of configured around this idea of Mediodía. The frenetic pace and grandiosity of his political visions are symptoms of his attempts to accommodate a difficult dimension of the past within the Spanish present. Notably, across his career, Ben Umayya made recourse to a large number of pseudonyms in his writings, as if a single name could not mediate the instability of the project he was pursuing. These included the names he used were Ben Omar, Amir Si Jalil Amugwai, Amir Sid Omar, Luis de Valor, Mulay Omar Torres, Torres Ben Umayya, each name sort of plotting a different Mediterranean trajectory, right? Connecting Arab with Spain along different lines in some way. A more telling demonstration of the ambiguity inherent in the Andalusista identity Ben Umayya was forging comes in a letter in 1933 he wrote to one of the leaders of the Moroccan nationalist struggle, in which he tried to explain some of the apparent paradoxes of his political viewpoint. So he writes, "I am certainly not Moroccan, but I am a Muslim. I'm above all Andalusian, in other words, an Arab. And I work for Spain because today my country forms a part of it, with the hope of bringing about a rebirth of Arab Spain." So Muslim, Andalusian, Arab, Spanish, these terms, and sometimes they included Jew in this is the way he would write. These terms unfold as if they're synonyms in some way, different perspectives on what Ben Umayya took to be a singular identity. In Morocco, Ben Umayya was known to be a descendant of a notable Muslim family. And there is some suggestion that on the basis of this heritage, he was considered to be a Muslim himself by many people, including some in Spain. Whether he encouraged this view or not is unclear, though outside the passing remark made in the letter, there's little evidence he considered himself to be a Muslim in any traditional sense. Perhaps the reference stems from his view that Islam was integral to the civilization that he himself belonged to, one he sought to cultivate and promote. What this meant to Ben Umayya exactly, I want to suggest, was a work in progress, one generative of the political and intellectual restlessness that characterizes his work. Let's see, what do I have here? Well, these are just kind of political schema he would draw up about possible mobilizations, counting the number of inhabitants, including Latin America often, like, if we bring all of these people together, they're natural allies, and and so on. I won't. Let's see. This is the quote, yeah. Pedro Martínez Montalvés, a contemporary Spanish scholar who has dedicated much of his life to an exploration of Spain's Arabic inheritance, describes this restlessness in terms of an eternal struggle within the Spanish soul. To refer to Hispano-Arabic, right? This notion of Hispano-Arabic, for mainstream historiography, this is a pure fiction. There is no Hispano-Arabic. I mean, that's a modern construction of, right? To refer to the Hispano-Arabic is to refer to a part of ourselves. There we go, great. It's to refer to a part of ourselves. To a part still obscure and buried, forgotten in its profundity, as Adolfo Reyes recalled, whose reactualization will either be felt as agreeable or disagreeable, depending on the individual, her formation, sentiments, and preferences, but that in no instance will be received with indifference. It will always agitate and disturb, certainly our deepest existence, our supposed identity, producing an interior dialectic that is entirely unsettling. I mean, much of the book that I've written on that's around is about that unsettling dimension. Lorca, for his part, described this dialectic as an ongoing struggle. Quote, "The graves of the Catholic kings," says Lorca, "have not prevented the half moon from rising at times within the breast of the most refined children of Granada. The battle continues." The half moon could be the crescent moon. The battle continues, obscure and without expression. Without expression? No. For on the red hill of the city, in Granada, there are two palaces, both dead, the Alhambra and the palace of Charles V, that sustain the duel to the death that beats in the conscience of the Granadan of today. the palace of Charles V was built inside the fortress of the Alhambra, right? After the Reconquista, like 100 years after. What do the lives of these two Andalusistas, Banu Umayya and Lorca, tell us about history and religion? As I see it, they invite us to recognize that the importance of the past to our lives is not necessarily satisfied by the type of dispassionate reflection undertaken by the discipline of history. Our lives may be oriented to certain pasts in ways that unsettle, disturb, captivate, or otherwise impact upon us, not due to some failure of disidentification, an inability to achieve a properly objective distance, but as a constitutive dimension of our existence. Right, the argument, right, that you know, they understood, they felt compelled by this past. And a past, though, that right, could not be objectified within the languages of historiography in what they saw an adequate form. Historiography was very important. They both read extensively in historiography and were trained, particularly Banu Umayya, by leading Arabists and so on. But they felt that the protocols of historiography, which is grounded in, we could say, a nationalist perspective, right? As the Spanish historiography emerges as part of the nationalist project and reflects the ideas about sort of relations between language, culture, territory, identity, and the way those coincide in ways. That to think about the way that past inhabited the present, right, could not be easily done within the assumptions of that nationalist historiography. And therefore, and yet nonetheless called to them in powerful ways, right? So that's what I mean by that history, the discipline of history, does not monopolize the ways in which the past may solicit and engage us. And that these other ways are not fictitious, even though they're not historiographic, you know, in that sense. I can clarify that more. The past thus conceived is not merely a tool of our interests, but a point of our vulnerability, where life exceeds our reflexive grasp of it. Right? They felt this past to be imposed upon them, not simply one that one voluntarily chose to inhabit, but that its very erasure from 17th century Spain to the present, its erasure was, you know, a problem within Spanish existence. Its failure to recognize that past. This gets formulated very powerfully by one of the leading sort of Spanish intellectuals in the 1940s, Americo Castro, who was fled the fascist regime and was at Princeton during this. But he was the one who liked the notion of convivencia, right? That comes from his work, right? And there's this thinking about interrelatedness and this thinking about. He coined this term "vivir desviviéndose," which means to live while denying one's own existence, something like this, right? That is, he saw Spain as somehow like disjointedly or oriented to itself. That how to live while denying the fundamental dimensions of oneself, or something like this. And his works were sought to develop such an idea. The philosopher Cora Diamond has sought to elaborate this aspect of experience in terms of what she calls difficulties of reality. When I say this aspect of experience, right, I'm saying that, like usually we think about history as, for example, history is the narrative we make of the past, one that we construct in accord with the demands of the present, right? And that's often the way we would understand So history in that sense is we think of it in a presentist way, right? It responds to the imperatives of the present. And, right, which, is adequate to a certain extent, but also does not recognize the extent to which we also, that the past is also a constraining dimension on our lives, that the past is, the present is not just invent itself in a moment, but does so on the basis of constraints inherited from the past, even though the kind of ideology of liberalism would suggest that we make a world ourselves, but we make it, even Marx said, right, we make it under conditions not of our choosing. It's things like this. Cora Diamond says, this phenomenon that I'm concerned with are experiences in which we take something in reality to be resistant to our ways of thinking it, or possibly to be painful in its inexplicability, difficult in this way, or perhaps awesome and astonishing in its inexplicability. Right, in the way that the Andalusistas took this past, it was not quite explainable because it's not quite, that past is not transparent to us because we don't have direct access to it in some way, and yet it imposes itself on it. And that's what it means by it proposes a kind of difficulty within our language, a difficulty in which their poetic explorations are part of the attempt to sort of encounter that difficulty. Diamond suggests that the reality we encounter may not only resist expression in our available languages, may not only leave us feeling that our ways of speaking are inadequate, blunt instruments. That resistance may forcibly impinge upon us, may compel us outside our familiar habits by the way it pains or astonishes or powerfully attracts us. Difficulties of reality in revealing reality to be resistant to our ways of thinking, right, including the way that what we inherit from the past may be resistant to our ways of thinking about it, may at times make us incomprehensible to ourselves, to others, and to ourselves. It is this incomprehension, I want to suggest, that we encounter in the rhetorics and poetics of Andalusismo and in the political imaginaries it has given rise to. Right, so I don't read it as a politics of identity that sort of exploits the past and to construct an identity, but rather a kind of people who encounter the sort of limits of their available languages to understand themselves, right, who they are. Because they find that they seem to have be shaped by a past that's in some ways inaccessible to them. That they are not the Catholic national subjects that they've been brought up to believe, right? And they find themselves surrounded by a world. All of the ruins, the monuments, the language in which Arabic is prominent, the customs, the gestures, in which they find that those gestures are inhabited by Arabic gestures, reflected from the other side of the Mediterranean, for example. And they start to explore these connections and correspondences, and which they find themselves not quite themselves in that way, right? They find them. All right, that's the last slide. In regard to religion, these Andalusistas find themselves to be ambiguously situated in relation to Islam. Not quite Muslims, for the most part, but not quite the subjects of Catholic Spain that their historians had told them they were. Note that my use of the term religion here, I'm not referring either to religion as belief or religion as practice, but to something else, what we might describe as a certain openness to Islam and to Muslim societies. Importantly, this openness does not authorize a single political stance. As I mentioned, Banu Umayya worked within the institutions of fascist Spain, while Lorca was murdered by fascist forces. While these two Spaniards found common ground, where they found common ground was in a style of thought, political and aesthetic, that refused to be constrained by the binaries of Christian, Muslim, European, Middle Eastern. These oppositions, of course, are deeply rooted in the ideological fabric of Europe. As scholars of early modern Europe have persuasively argued, Europe's historical animosity toward Islam involved more than a natural antipathy felt for a rival, forming a significant factor in the emergence of the notion of Europe itself. As the historian Thomas Masnak has noted, Europe as a self-conscious collective identity emerged relatively late in the course of human events, and Western Latin Christians' hostility toward Muslims, anti-Muslim sentiments, ideas, calls for action and action, played a key role in its formation. During the war in Bosnia, it could be recalled that Serbs sought support for their assault on Bosnia by portraying their actions as a European crusade, carried out by Europeans in the name of Europe. Right? And they were recognized, and that language was recognized in many quarters, right? And that indeed there was something not quite European about having Muslims in Europe. The political stakes of this exclusionary stance toward Islam are ever more clear today. For some years now, European political life has devolved to a significant extent around the question of whether and how Muslim immigrants are to be accorded a place within European societies. Also in the United States and even in Brazil, I think. Many in Europe today view Muslim immigrants as representatives of an alien civilization, one incompatible with and a direct threat to modern European values and freedoms. To proponents of this view, Europe is seen as the product of a unique historical trajectory, one whose moral and political virtues were grown from a Judeo-Christian soil, mostly Christian and then recently Judeo-Christian, which Islam does not share. A comment by the German sociologist and philosopher Jürgen Habermas exemplifies this stance. He says, "Universalistic egalitarianism, from which sprang the ideals of freedom and a collective life in solidarity, the autonomous conduct of life and emancipation, the individual morality of conscience, human rights, democracy, is the direct legacy of the Judaic ethics of justice and the Christian ethic of love. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of continual critical appropriation and reinterpretation. To this day, there is no alternative to it. And in light of the current challenges of a post-national constellation, we continue to draw on the substance of this constellation. Everything else is just idle postmodern talk." Idle is like otios or something, right? Or ocios. Ocioso, yeah. No direct reference to Europe is needed to anchor such a striking claim. As Habermas's readers will recognize, there is only one civilizational location whose celebrated heritage is universally recognizable in such terms as human rights, democracy, autonomy, and individual morality. For Andalusistas, such claims do not ring of historical truth, but rather are meant to dull the ears and eyes to Europe's thoroughly Mediterranean heritage. For these men and women living on Europe's southernmost periphery, the complex medieval sociology that characterized Mediterranean life, one with both musical and existential echoes today, demands an ethical and political stance against such contemporary calls to harden the barriers between one side of the sea and the other. So that's it. Obrigado.
Thank you, obrigado.
Thank you.
Very
Very something.
Yeah. So now you can
Take some
questions
yes.
from the audience. So
Pode trazer.
Acho que eles seriam...
Speak slowly and
Em primeiro lugar, é uma lembrança que Cervantes lutou na Batalha de Lepanto, que é a batalha
the Batalha de Lepanto, yeah.
né? Então, a questão da reconquista, mesmo depois da reconquista, ainda estava em aberto. Mas isso para introduzir a minha questão da União Ibérica, se existe no pensamento andaluzista, né, que você colocou aqui, o tema da União Ibérica, né, por conta dessa questão do al-Andalus, porque isso tem uma grande repercussão na política do Brasil por conta do sebastianismo. Que foi a derrota, né, de Dom Sebastião, justamente no norte do Marrocos, E essa derrota dele, não só o que envolveu, mas a paisagem, essa paisagem do norte da África e sul da Península Ibérica, ela foi transposta para o Brasil e também foi transposta como um modelo político, né, milenarista. E né, dizem que Dom Sebastião ele é um touro numa praia do Maranhão, ou seja, como você está falando, é uma história vívida, né? E influenciou um movimento literário muito famoso aqui, que é o movimento armorial, que recupera justamente essa musicalidade que você está falando. E o mais interessante é que tem religiões afro-indígenas que veio o Dom Sebastião como um ser encantado e também os mouros. Então, o que era uma batalha virou uma cosmologia.
So I need some translation there. And I know something about Sebastianism, but if you could translate some of that, just the name.
He said that it was incorporated into Brazil, but it became sort of in a mythical and cosmological way through music. And
So, let me ask you, Sebastianism, right? Sebastian, right? He disappeared apparently in Morocco or something, right? He's known to have been, and then, there's the idea that the sort of myth is he went into a kind of occultation, kind of like the Mahdi or something. He's like, and may come back at some point, right?
yes.
But does Sebastianism include therefore this sort of geography of the Middle East and Latin America? So in Brazil,
North Brazil and Northeast mainly.
Yes.
A política são os que
Well, I think that your question is about the union, the Iberic Union. So
yes.
This would be an al-Andalusian project too.
Absolutely, yes. And it's embarrassing to give this here because many places have said, but what you haven't talked about Portugal and certainly and therefore Brazil, and so that is a big problem, and I should talk about Portugal because clearly it's part of this same formation, and there is movements in Portugal, and Sebastianism is one aspect of these movements, not the only one, and there are contemporary movements in some of them linked to contemporary immigrants, and I mean I should say I didn't mention here, but this movement, my interest and some aspects of the movement have to do with contemporary immigration to North African immigration to Spain, right? That's what got me interested in this sort of, right? Because of the response, the sort of anxieties about North African immigration in Spain, like in much parts of Europe. But I mean, part of the sort of what Andalusismo is very much engaged in today, shaped by that immigration. I mean, if we're thinking about like this, what shapes the relation to the past, this changing complexion of Spanish, like the presence of Muslim immigrants, is part of what shapes the way in which this past now resonates in the present, right? If we think about how the way in which we become to be attuned to the past has to do with aspects of the present. That doesn't mean we invent the past, but it means that the way in which we encounter it will be shaped by. So the presence of Muslim immigrants, of course, is part of the transformations we're taking place. I think what you're talking about, the musical soundscape of northern Brazil, right, and the way in which Sebastianism creates a kind of sonic mythical space, right? I think it's very much involved in the same, and very similar kinds of reflections and it's probably even more fascinating here, more exuberant, and I wish I knew more about it. But I'm glad you highlight that, but I just don't know much about it.
So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
One of the research groups here in Cebrap are currently developing a research agenda about counterpublics.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to make a question about your previous work. Could you tell us a little bit about your personal history with the concept counterpublic and your reception? How did you first approach the concept and how it became useful for your ethnography? And my second question is, I'm trying to make a relation to your paper today.
Okay.
Do you think that the concept of counterpublic continues to be important for your research agenda today? For example, is there an Andalusian counterpublic where the Andalusism is produced and circulates as a fragmentary and subterranean counter-discourse in tension with the public discourse about Spain, a Catholic nationalist public discourse? We talked about a couple of times about world making.
Yeah.
And world making is a central characteristic for Michael Warner's approach of public
let me start by asking the second part, which is an interesting way to put it. So, the reason why I would not say that, Andalusismo is not, for the most part, an organized movement in ways. In some ways, while there are certain kinds of Andalusian activists, including political activists, many of the Andalusistas are, I would say, poets, musicians, artists, architects, journalists, people in different areas of life. My book is organized around a chapter on music, a chapter on art and architecture, a chapter on politics, and a chapter on history, as a way of thinking how Andalusismo functions in these different areas. But I see Andalusismo is a kind of sensibility that embedded in Andalusian society in ways. So it has a kind of presence in different institutions which have different roles. Now, some of those institutions are like institutions that help immigrants coming from the Middle East. Some are institutions more academically oriented, some are more politically or aesthetically oriented. Some are, very much, institutions that we would see as part of the cultural politics of the state, and therefore part of a kind of politics of heritage mobilization, right? Let me give you another example. You know the Alianza for Civilizations, the Alliance for Civilizations? It was a UN initiative put forward by Zapatero and the then leader of Turkey, a joint project, and it's now part of the UN. A kind of project to establish, to create a UN forum for improving relations between the Middle East and Europe in some ways, right? To create a space of dialogue. And so we can easily read this. This was on one hand, a way that the Spanish regime mobilizes its own history for political capital on an international stage. Right? I mean, clearly we can understand. On the other hand, if you read the founding documents of it, it was like Ben Umayya wrote it. Like they're like almost poetic about the stones and the speaking and so on. There's a way in which it adopts the language of Andalusismo to sort of speak about why that civilizational presence, why it's significant today in a political arena, right? It requires sort of the resources of a certain kind of Andalusista thought to kind of, and in some ways, of course, and it's the possibilities of that is dependent on a certain history, right? A certain history that, including a history that joins Turkey to Spain, that makes that alliance possible in a way. So even if it's subject to kind of political strategy, so what I'm saying, trying to get is that Andalusismo traverses a whole variety of institutions, and even if it doesn't determine them, but it's part of what makes them possible in ways, right? And in that sense, it doesn't form a counter-public. Something else, though, that kind of is a kind of, it creates certain sort of possibilities, and it continues to be cultivated by generations who both within educational institutions in Spain, by activists. There are thousands of NGOs in southern Spain that sort of seek to, it has to do with all of the ways in which, I mean, the fascist Spain also helped in these ways because, Franco's politics had to do with building relations to the Middle East, right? Very favorable, right? Saddam Hussein was like a good buddy, right? I mean, there was all these strategic ways in which Spain was aligned with the Middle East, but that was also part, certainly for obvious strategic reasons, but it was also part of establishing all kinds of enduring relations that remain. Half the Andalusistas I know live half their lives in Morocco for the most part. Now, there's very strong connections because Morocco in some way is essential to the kind of forms of knowledge that Andalusismo produces and requires. Like even the music form. Medieval Spanish music could not be found within Spain because it was lost. Its remnants are only in Morocco, because Morocco has a continuous tradition of Andalusian music. Spain did not. Spain has the texts, the literary aspects, but nothing about the music. So Spanish musicians had to go to Morocco to learn from the Moroccan tradition of music, a tradition that's grounded in rather different precepts than European notions of musical history, because Moroccan Andalusian music underwent all sorts of changes, but those changes are not understood. They're understood to be entirely compatible with and the foundations of medieval Andalusi music, not a deviation from it, but just a sort of development within it, as opposed to a kind of historicist reading would say, well, these are like accretions that have to do with its modern career. Right? There's a notion of tradition as opposed to a notion of history operative within. But there's all these ways in which the Middle East became, both for people's personal lives, political lives, aesthetic lives, part of this sensibility. This is a long answer, but you set it up. So I think of it more as a sensibility than as a counterpublic, because it does not. I think that counterpublic, the notion, is a way of focusing on certain kinds of political questions, and for me, in Egypt, it had to do with a way to kind of thematize some of the kind of political status and political dimensions of what had been a long-standing ethical practice within Islam, but which now operated in newly politicized domains, right? Domains of media circulation, domains of a public sphere constituted through a national political effort, right? And so the very notions were able to highlight the way in which what I call a kind of religious ethical tradition, right? How it had now intersected with and had ramifications and implications for political life and drew from, had been reconfigured in some ways by the way it was refashioned as a kind of public, that is through certain, what Michael Warner would call a kind of stranger sociability mediated through instruments of mass media and so on. So I think, there is a way in which that's what led me to use the term there, and why I wouldn't. That was a long answer. I apologize for that.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
Sure.
Really, because then you give us a Quixote who is not between feudalism and capitalism, but
that's right.
Muslim Spain and Reconquista.
Yeah.
And then you give us Lorca, who is not a nationalist, as which one would suspect of surrealism or something, but someone that is in a similar position as that of Cervantes.
Right.
I mean, in this sense, I think you were a Benjaminian, Walter Benjamin, so that you see the past that is actualized by the present, and this is really interesting. My question would be, I didn't really read your book, so I'm not exploiting you here. In the sense that, I mean, you try to find a common ground between Lorca and Benumaya.
Yeah.
First, the impression I have is that Benumaya is much more important to construct Andalusismo than Lorca. But you want to say, well, this is possible to have a leftist and a right-wing position and to find a common ground. Then the common ground is openness to Islam. Isn't it too thin to really come to this minimal definition? How could we make this position stronger? This is just an impression from a presentation. You know, it's, you might have developed it in your book, and I don't have a clue.
I mentioned open to Islam, but that's not really what I'm saying Andalusismo is about. Though I do think that it's about thinking outside the binaries that I mentioned, right? About Islam versus, but it's not just about openness, and it's certainly not some kind of. It's not that. I mean, today Andalusismo is mostly. One finds the languages of Andalusismo among multicultural activists, right? It's a left-wing, multicultural, liberal movement. Are those who sort of inherit more than anyone else, and for them it means a kind of openness. But that's not really, what I'm saying. They think that it's about, convivencia in terms of we can all get along. I don't think convivencia is central to Andalusismo in some ways. It's not quite about all getting along, and it's rather right. In some ways, it has more to do with finding that it's an exploration of sort of dimensions of self that have been partially erased, and that opens up a reflection on certain kinds of norms of European society, and a reflection for which the Middle East is important, and a reconsideration of the entwinement with the Middle East is important. But it's not just like openness or something. It's not like, I don't think there's, indeed, like you can think that it certainly was part of the colonial apparatus. At least the discourses were appropriated by, and many of the Andalusistas were favorable of colonialism. They were favorable of fascism, I think, because they saw fascism as, I mentioned the idea of world making. They saw the very kind of the fascist idea of, creating the new man through the massive agency of the state and so on, like part of a dream of remaking the world in some radical way in accord with new precepts and so on, right? I think that some of them were attracted to that very fascist idea. So I'm not, I certainly was not trying to argue that, I hope I didn't argue, that it's just about openness or openness to Islam. I do think that where those two overlap, right, they overlapped in a lot of ways. Like they had all kinds of musical collaborations. Lorca and Benumaya were in contact frequently. And, we're part of a kind of network that involves scholars like Garcia Gomez and Asin Palacios, but also these kind of non-scholarly things. And they certainly would not have recognized openness to Islam as their own, even though they recognized that Islam was very significant to who they were. Right? So that maybe is a different way to sort of. They certainly both they both worked together that Islam should be studied, that Islam should be, it had to be sort of more seriously, it deserved attention in ways that it was not being given.
Just curiosity, what happened to the Judeo tradition? Because they also were erased from the memory of Spain, and Jerusalem, all of this is not in this, what happened to them. And also, why in your description of this tradition, the religion doesn't fit? What happened to the Quran
Most of the Andalusistas do not practice Islam in any way. Like if you look at some of their careers, they study Arabic, they study the Quran, maybe, but not as religious practitioners, what we would call.
But that is the problem with Islam in Europe, is religion and not culture. Or no?
For the distinction between religion and culture, it's like where to draw the line, which aspects of is Andalusista thought are embracing the religion and which are the culture or something. It's not that's not quite clear. There's not a way in which, this is religious and that's culture. I think that the kind of explorations they do of Islam, it does lead today it leads many people to convert and so on. So one could say that's related to this movement of Andalusismo as one sort of dimension of it. But when you say, isn't religion the problem? Yes, religion is the problem for this, and this is why yes, it's the Muslims who invade. Not the Arabs, but the Muslims. And I think in Spain, there's much more the idea of the Muslim invasion, where much of the rest of academia talks about the Arab invasion. But for Spaniards, it's particularly a religious problem. And so there are ways in which that gets for many Spaniards, and certainly for Spanish historians and so on, the question of religion is key. The first thing you asked me, it was about the Judeo, yeah. And so Ben Umayyah saw that he was also very interested in Sephardism and wrote about it, and he was very enthusiastic about Jews returning to Palestine. And he saw this the same thing as Arab resurgence. He said this is another face of pan-Islamism. And it's all part of the Semitic principle expressing itself, finally, returning to. When he saw it involved territorial expropriation, then he became highly critical, and one of the most critical of the nationalist project in Israel, right? Which made no sense for him from his view of Semitic resurgence, which he saw as a violation of it. So it was interesting, and you see this in Muhammad Asad's writing too. He goes and visits Jerusalem early, and he notes he doesn't understand why the Jews think so poorly of the Arabs, but he's still a Jew himself, and he's still sort of enthusiastic about ideas, but he doesn't quite understand this highly derogatory stance. And there's something about it's interesting that I think that aspects of Andalusista kind of thought is these viewpoints seem to be part of it in some ways, or the kind of more complicated ways of thinking about the Zionist project, for example. I should just say Sephardic Jews in 2016 were given rights to return to Spain, right? And in the law mentions that Jews have always been in Spain, and they are present today in the stones and in our language, and all the Andalusista language came we hear their voices when we speak our own language by the imprint of Hebrew and so on, and in our own houses and so on. So that whole language was part of the way in which Jews became sort of recognizable as inheritors and deserving citizenship, for which Muslims are not seen as, for other reasons.
Se alguém mais quiser se inscrever, a gente junta. Então, maybe we can put two.
Yeah, please, that'd be good, yeah.
So thank you for amazing talk, and I will try to make it quick.
not sure your answer will be. So,
No, it'll be quick too this time.
But you said this was about a liminal space glimpsed only through fragments. This is a fragment of one of your sentences.
Yeah.
And my question is, how was it to do research on something that is so hard to grasp? So I saw that you went through, you said, chapters on architecture, art, and you gave us two authors who were very self-aware of and trying to rework that sensibility.
Yeah, right.
So my question is on the difficulties of researching something that's so hard to grasp, and how this connects with this change that you also mentioned from subject to sensibility. So the difficulties of grasping a sensibility that goes beyond these two authors that you brought to us today.
Yeah, yeah.
How you deal to bring that up.
That's a good question. Yeah, I would just say. Oh yeah, I'll take another. Yeah.
Okay, just one would be very the issue of race. Maybe if you could develop a little bit, because at some point the map. So what about sort of sub-Saharan Africa, like the great Muslim empires there? But at some point the map, I could say I think Sudan was part of it, and was it?
Yeah.
Right, so there's this because it would connect to the question of race too, which is part of the present, right? In Spain, so Muslims, but also sub-Saharan Muslims. And, like, do they talk about the caliphates in like Mali? Is this part of this kind of economia they're trying to visualize? The second one was just this comment, and I think that's the stuff about accusing something, and when I read the material religion piece, I was really struck by that, how at a sort of meta level what your work is doing, and it's very bold, right, because you actually going into that space that all of us have become used to dismiss as romantic, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is just romantic, orientalist, and you actually, I think it's the first person I've ever seen, and sometimes you might connect to kind of decolonial turn people who are like Gilberto Freire, who are also into this domain of murkiness. And so it's really dangerous politically.
Totally, yeah.
Right? And super dangerous. And because overall your political stance is also, so maybe you could talk about your stance overall to like multiculturalism, pluralism, because it seems this is of course critical of assimilation alternative, which is one of the alternatives Muslims have in Europe, but it's also very critical, I guess, of the multicultural pluralist alternative too, right? You call that left, but
well, I said liberal too.
Yeah. In a way, it's like an anti-Said book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Directly to this idea of politics of representation and all that. And,
yes. Yes. I mean,
it's not even a question. It's just.
Okay. Just if there's one more, I would take it then.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. There's a. I think I end the first chapter by saying, this book, this book in some way walks the same thin edge as I see the Orientalist to walk. That is, trucking in the Oriental while trying to avoid falling into its sterile fantasies. Like you're playing in the domain of the Orientalist, but you're also trying to sort of avoid the kind of things that Said highlights, right? And I see that, I want just, on that point, like there's some ways in which there's a point in there's a sentence from the writer Sebald, the German writer, literary writer, he writes a lot about history. Sebald, A History of Natural Destruction, he wrote, or Austerlitz. He writes about Germany and so on, but he makes this point at one point, I remember in his book, that, in some ways, we in many he has to do with thinking about the inaccessibility of the past on one hand, but in some ways it's only accessible at images whose provenance, whose relation to the past we can't ever really even be, you can't really quite ascertain quite how faithful they are to what they depict, because you inherit them as, and I think, I see on one hand that Andalusians inherit a kind of Orientalist set of images, through which, as the kind of lens through which they kind of approach the questions, as in part of the language popularly available. But I think that it's at the same time they're constantly sort of trying to come up against recognize the limits of those languages, and I see their efforts as confronting like a fundamental problem of our relation to the past is that it's always mediated by the certain kinds of images constructed in the present, and that creates a kind of a certain sort of challenge almost, which is what I meant by that last line. Let me go back to.
It's just a comment, and that's how I think in your argument. It's very important the material culture, right?
It's very what?
The material element, like they're interpolated by like traces, and that's
yes.
history acting in a way, right? So it's
yes.
not about subjectivity and identity.
Right.
So like things are very important. Right?
Things are very important, yeah.
And sounds too, of course.
Yes, sounds and this is why Lorca is sort of important for this tradition, right? Because of course Lorca is a kind of archaeology of the composition of the Granadan, material landscape and so on. And that's this kind of practice becomes it has to do with learning like correspondences and attuning to things in a distinct way. And like Granada and Cordoba and these places become sites for which one cultivates as both Lorca, is a good example, but much earlier in the 19th century, there's, a key thinker, Ganivet, who writes a book called Granada la Bella that is a kind of key point of reference. And he's like an interlocutor with Unamuno, this very important turn of the century literary figure. But they're about like, they're trying to invoke a language of the senses, this sort of how do we sort of, what is it to sort of experience through the eyes, through the ears, and there's very much through the senses what it is to inhabit this kind of hybrid landscape. And there's a kind of various explorations of how what that materially, explorations of that material landscape and trying to give it form in language is very much part of this. And the language of sort of, of a romantic language, like of course noting correspondences and like Baudelaire, that's sort of language of, correspondences between Arabic and Spanish, or between, yeah, I think it is politically dangerous for various ways, and it's it's a very fraught territory because it's when I go to Spain, the immediate accusation, I didn't know anything about this when I went to Spain, and the guy said, "Oh, another North American romantic." And now, after years of studying it, and here I write what seems to be a romantic text, it's like a disaster for the standpoint of the Spanish. It's like a swamp that I've been absorbed into, and so on. Right? So to do that is like, it's going to be infuriating. So I have a lot of the introduction to the book is trying to sort of re-engage romanticism and like what do we mean when we say that, and what kind of accusation is it, and what were the romantics involved in thinking history that perhaps is not adequately thought of when we just use it as a term of dismissal. Even though the fact that it's associated with romantic nationalism, which culminates in fascism, seems to give a historically indubitable signpost for what romanticism is. Right? It's sort of, that's been the lens through which makes it easy gives a shorthand to our understanding of romanticism, that as it's bad, dangerous, and it leads to fascism in its worst. So, like, you know, I mean, yes, I think it's going to be a problem. I've tried to deal with it as best I can in some ways, but I mean, the text is not, you know, there are lots of romantic treatments of this that, and I've tried to some way like mark a distance from some of those. The question you started with about the liminal space seems to be fragments, yes, and how to study. You know, on one hand, it's easier if you start with people who are activists in this area. It's right, and read the people who were activists and work with the contemporary ones. So I worked with, you know, artists and art historians and musicians. I worked a lot with musicians. I worked with, I spent a lot of time with historians, including some of the few Andalusista historians. And to sort of attune myself to get a sense of, and then, and when I say that, sort of, to kind of recognize what they had come to sort of recognize and sort of see it, therefore, in spaces that were not necessarily marked by obvious Andalusista identity, or, right, that were sort of, so, and I mentioned various institutions, how it's part of a kind of institutional fabric. Like, it's interesting, like I would go to concerts in Granada, in which there's a lot of mixes with flamenco and Middle Eastern musics that's become more popular, and so you can go even to like very traditional musical settings in the outskirts of Granada, where they will perform things in which people will also be speaking in Arabic, and you will have Moroccans performing quite a bit, even though it's a flamenco concert and so on. And you have these strange sort of things, and so talking to people in places like this that are not like Andalusista places, because these are villagers or these are people from the classes of Granada who they're probably voting for the Vox party, which is like the fascist party in Spain to that. I know. I mean, they're probably, and yet those spaces, it seems to me they're indebted to aspects of, to a kind of sensibilities that Andalusismo has made possible within southern Spain particularly. Right, a certain kind of appreciations of that involve Arabic and that involve things that might otherwise, like from the Reconquista stance of the Vox party or something, you know, people would be uncomfortable with some of that. So yes, so I say a liminal space, right? I mean, it's on one hand there's something horribly obvious about this space. There's nothing liminal, like from the standpoint of like. I was talking, you know, on one hand it's obvious that, you know, if you notice the Spanish language or something that is saturated with Arabic terms, there's something like obvious about the presence of the Arabic and something. And so if almost all of, you know, Spanish modern history is built on saying there's no relation, it seems very odd. Like, so that's a very ideological project, we would say, in which that seems where there's these obvious ways in which there's all kinds of relations. So you have to sort of redefine these things as not actually related. But so all of, I mean, I worked with flamencologists in Spain. All of flamencology is built on the saying that flamenco has no relation to the Middle East. And, you know, if to say it does, you've fallen into a silly romanticism and you've lost all historical sense. Yeah, I spent years in Cairo, and when I hear flamenco, like I hear the streets of Cairo. Now, they would say, oh, you got another romantic year or something, right? They say, no, look, you hear that, but you really, that's because of you've been, you know, you've picked up the romantic bug, so you hear, you know, you love to hear the Arabic because it makes you feel, you know, something. But, you know, I'd say they've learned not to hear it, and they've built it into the science of flamencology, where the very strong voices say, this has nothing to do with it. Flamenco is a 19th century construction of Spanish nationalism, entirely built on the principles of, and subservient to the nationalist function of the language that has no relation to. So there's a way of historicizing that blocks that. On the other hand, it seems pretty obvious. So it's not as liminal in some ways. It's, you know, liminal from one standpoint, but not as others. Yeah, this question of race and so race was like this, like the Semitic race or something was part of this language, and this is part of the language of Semitism. Right? Semitism had a short career as a concept, and then sort of died because once, for various reasons, that it tended to group Arabs and Jews, which then became an unhappy grouping, and so now the term is not seen to carry any, you know, maybe except in a few linguistic departments or something, it does not really have a career that it once had, because for obvious political reasons. But in a certain moment there was this idea, and race provided a kind of, and so how it extended to the South. So I think the earlier Andalusistas reflected much more on sub-Saharan Africa. Like you find that in Ben Umayya, you find considerable, like in his book there's a section on sub-Saharan Africa, on Mali, and there's considerable. Today, much less, seems to me. There was a way in which that was more available as a kind of, we are African, was, you know, this whole moment of, so, I haven't answered all your questions, but you asked too many. But we can talk about some of them later.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.